What if the 9 economic patterns that triggered the Great Depression aren't warnings from history, but blueprints currently in motion? Most people think we learned from 1929. The Federal Reserve was reformed, banking regulations were created, safety nets were built. They're not wrong about what happened after the crash, but they're missing what's happening right now. Between 2019 and 2024, household debt reached $17.5 trillion, exceeding pre-2008 crisis levels when adjusted for GDP. Corporate debt hit $10.5 trillion, representing 47% of GDP compared to 22% in 1929. The stock market's price-to-earnings ratio stands at 28, higher than the 25 ratio just before Black Tuesday. These aren't coincidences. They're the same structural vulnerabilities operating in a different era. Let me show you how 9 specific patterns from the Great Depression are reconstructing themselves in real time. The world didn't see 1929 coming because the 1920s looked like unprecedented prosperity. Industrial production had increased 50% between 1921 and 1929. The Dow Jones climbed from 63 points in 1921 to 381 by September 1929. That's a 500% increase in 8 years. Consumer goods flooded American homes. Radios, refrigerators, automobiles. General Motors sold 1.9 million vehicles in 1929 alone. Unemployment sat below 4%. President Herbert Hoover declared in 1928 that America was nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before. The surface looked golden, but underneath, 3 structural problems were building. First, agricultural prices had collapsed after World War I ended. Wheat that sold for $2.19 per bushel in 1919 dropped to $1.03 by 1929. Farmers who had expanded during wartime faced debt they couldn't service. Farm foreclosures reached 18 per 1,000 farms annually by 1926. Second, wages weren't keeping pace with productivity. Industrial output per worker increased 32% between 1923 and 1929, but wages rose only 8%. That gap meant workers couldn't afford the goods they were producing. Third, wealth concentration reached levels not seen since the Gilded Age. The top 1% held 23.9% of all wealth in 1929. The bottom 93% saw their share of national income decline throughout the decade. Think about what this meant in practical terms. If you were a factory worker in Detroit in 1928, you were producing more cars than ever, but your wages hadn't risen enough to actually buy one. The solution was debt. Consumer credit expanded 50% between 1925 and 1929. Installment buying became standard. By 1929, 60% of automobiles and 80% of radios were purchased on credit. The economy wasn't running on wage growth, it was running on borrowed purchasing power. And debt has a mathematical limit. This brings us to pattern 1, credit expansion masking wage stagnation. In 1929, the debt-to-income ratio for American households reached 9.3%. It seemed manageable. By 2023, that ratio hit 101%. Today's workers face the same structural problem as 1929 workers, but the scale is 40 times larger. The average American household carries $155,000 in total debt against a median income of $74,000. Credit card debt reached $1.13 trillion by late 2023, with average interest rates at 22.8%. Student loan debt stands at $1.77 trillion. Auto loans total $1.58 trillion, with the average new car payment at $739 per month. The mechanism is identical to 1929. Wages stagnate while productivity rises. The gap gets filled with debt, and debt eventually demands payment. Pattern 2 operates in parallel. Stock market speculation detached from economic reality. In 1929, margin buying allowed investors to purchase stocks with just 10% down. Brokerage loans reached $8.5 billion by October 1929, nearly 10% of GDP. Small investors borrowed heavily to buy stocks that kept rising. The logic was simple. If stocks always go up, borrowed money is free money, until they stop going up. By September 1929, the market's price-to-earnings ratio hit 25, far above the historical average of 15. Stocks were priced for perfection in an economy with foundational cracks. Today, Margin debt in U.S. markets reached $773 billion in 2023. That's approximately 3% of GDP, lower than 1929's ratio, but representing far more sophisticated leverage through derivatives, options, and algorithmic trading. The average investor in 2023 holds positions through 401ks and IRFs that are 80% stock-weighted, up from 54% in 1995. Exchange-traded funds hold $7.3 trillion in assets, much of it tracking indexes regardless of individual company fundamentals. When everyone owns the same stocks through passive funds, selling pressure amplifies. The 2023 price-to-earnings ratio of 28 exceeds 1929's peak. And just like 1929, the disconnect between market valuations and economic fundamentals grows wider each quarter. Pattern 3. Banking fragility through interconnected risk. In 1929, American banks operated without deposit insurance, without reserve requirements, and without federal oversight. Between 1929 and 1933, 9,000 banks failed. When banks collapsed, depositors lost everything. The failure of one bank triggered runs on others. Bank of United States in New York held deposits from 400,000 customers when it failed in December 1930, the largest bank failure in American history at that time. But here's what most people don't understand. The banks weren't failing because they'd made obviously bad loans. They were failing because they were connected through correspondent banking networks. When one failed, others held their worthless paper. The system was integrated just enough to spread contagion, but not regulated enough to contain it. Fast forward to 2023. Silicon Valley Bank held $209 billion in assets when it collapsed in March, making it the second largest bank failure in U.S. history. The failure triggered immediate concerns about Signature Bank, which collapsed days later, with $110 billion in assets. First Republic Bank followed 2 months later, with $233 billion in assets. 3 major bank failures in 10 weeks. The FDIC insures deposits up to $250,000, which sounds protective until you realize that 89% of SVB's deposits exceeded that limit and weren't insured. The 2008 crisis taught banks to diversify their risk, so they did. They all diversified into the same assets. When interest rates rose in 2022-2023, banks across the system were holding long-term bonds that had lost 20 to 30% of their value. Different banks, identical vulnerability. In 1929, banks were connected through correspondent relationships. Today, they're connected through common asset holdings, derivative exposure, and Federal Reserve facilities. The integration is deeper, the speed of contagion is faster, and too big to fail has become too interconnected to isolate. Which brings us to pattern 4, income inequality creating consumption crisis. The top 0.1% of Americans held 25% of total wealth in 1929. By 1933, after the crash, that percentage had actually increased. The wealthy survived the Depression. The middle class was destroyed. In 1929, the bottom 40% of American families spent 97% of their income on necessities. They had no buffer. When wages fell or jobs disappeared, they stopped consuming immediately. The economy depended on mass consumption, but wealth concentration meant consumption was fragile. Today, the top 1% holds 32.3% of all wealth, higher than 1929's peak. The bottom 50% holds 2.6% of total wealth. That's not a misprint. Half of all Americans control less than 3% of national wealth. The median household has $5,300 in savings. 63% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. Think about what this means for economic resilience. In 1929, when 40% of families lived at subsistence level, the economy was vulnerable to consumption collapse. Today, when 63% of families can't handle a $400 emergency expense, the vulnerability is broader and deeper. The wealthy save. The middle class borrows. And when borrowing stops, consumption craters. Pattern 5. Asset bubbles in essential goods. In the 1920s, the bubble wasn't just stocks, it was real estate. Florida's land boom between 1924 and 1926 saw property values increase 400% in 2 years. Speculation drove prices completely detached from use value. Buyers purchased land they never saw, planning to flip it before making the first payment. When the bubble burst in 1926, 3 years before the stock crash, it foreshadowed the broader collapse. Banks holding Florida real estate loans were already weakened when 1929 arrived. Housing prices in the United States increased 47% between 2019 and 2023. The median home price reached $417,000 by late 2023, while median household income was $74,000. That's a price-to-income ratio of 5.6, compared to the historical average of 3.8. The ratio in 1929 was 4.1. Home ownership is becoming mathematically impossible for an entire generation. But here's where it gets worse. Institutional investors purchased 90,000 single-family homes in 2022 alone. Corporations like Invitation Homes and American Homes for Rent control hundreds of thousands of properties, treating housing as a financial asset rather than shelter. When homes become investment vehicles for the wealthy instead of places for families to live, the pattern from 1929 is repeating with precision. Essential goods priced beyond reach of ordinary income. Speculation driving prices. An eventual collapse when buyers disappear. Pattern 6 brings us to corporate behavior. Debt-funded stock buybacks instead of investment. In the 1920s, corporations used cheap credit not to expand production, but to manipulate stock prices. Companies bought their own shares, driving prices higher and enriching executives with stock options. It looked like value creation. It was wealth extraction. When the crash came, companies had inflated stock prices but hadn't built resilient businesses. Between 2010 and 2023, S&P 500 companies spent $6.3 trillion on stock buybacks. That's money that could have gone to worker wages, research and development, or building new capacity. Instead, it went to boost stock prices and CEO compensation. Apple alone spent $467 billion on buybacks between 2012 and 2023. Corporate debt used for buybacks reached $2.3 trillion by 2023. Companies borrowed money at low interest rates to buy their own stock at high prices. The logic only works if stock prices keep rising. In 1929, when stock prices fell, companies that had bought back shares faced debt with nothing to show for it. The same mechanism is armed and waiting today. $10.5 trillion in corporate debt, much of it used not for productive investment, but for financial engineering. And when the next downturn hits, companies will face debt service on money that generated no real economic value. Pattern 7. Global trade imbalances and protectionist response. In 1929, the U.S. ran trade surpluses, while European economies struggled with war debt. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 raised tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods. U.S. trading partners retaliated immediately. Global trade collapsed 66% between 1929 and 1934. What started as an American recession became a worldwide depression, because economic integration meant problems spread, but political fragmentation meant solutions couldn't coordinate. U.S. trade policy between 2018 and 2024 imposed tariffs on $350 billion worth of Chinese goods. China retaliated with tariffs on U.S. agricultural products and manufactured goods. The trade war reduced global GDP growth from 3.8% in 2017 to 2.9% by 2019. But here's the deeper parallel. In 1929, the U.S. was the world's largest creditor nation. By 2024, the U.S. is the world's largest debtor, owing $7.6 trillion to foreign holders of treasury bonds. China alone holds over $800 billion. The trade dynamics have reversed, but the instability is identical. Integrated economies with fragmented politics, trade wars that escalate rather than resolve, and debt relationships that constrain policy options. When the 1930s crisis hit, tariffs made it worse. Today's tariffs are already in place before the crisis arrives. Pattern 8 reveals itself in Federal Reserve policy, raising interest rates into weakness. The Federal Reserve raised interest rates 4 times between January 1928 and August 1929, bringing the discount rate from 3.5% to 6%. The goal was to cool stock speculation. The result was to strangle business credit and consumer lending. By the time the Fed reversed course after the crash, it was too late. The rate increases had tightened credit just as the economy needed expansion. Between March 2022 and July 2023, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates 11 times, from 0.25% to 5.5%. That's the fastest rate increase cycle since the 1980s. The stated goal was to fight inflation. The effect was to increase debt service costs across the entire economy. Mortgage rates went from 3% to 7.8%. Credit card rates hit 22.8%. Corporate borrowing costs doubled. The Fed's own research in December 2023 estimated that higher rates had removed $400 billion in purchasing power from the economy annually. Think about what this means. In 1929, the Fed tightened into weakness, triggering contraction. In 2023, the Fed tightened into an economy already carrying record debt levels. Every rate increase makes existing debt more expensive to service. Companies with floating rate debt face higher costs. Consumers with variable rate credit cards see payments rise. And the mechanism is identical to 1929. Monetary tightening that accelerates the very crisis it's meant to prevent. Pattern 9 completes the architecture, political gridlock preventing response. When the Depression hit in 1929, President Hoover believed government intervention would make things worse. He opposed direct relief, federal jobs programs, and banking reform. Congress debated while unemployment reached 25%. The Banking Act of 1933 and Securities Exchange Act of 1934 didn't come until after Roosevelt took office and Democrats controlled both houses. By then, 4 years of collapse had destroyed wealth that would take decades to rebuild. The political system couldn't respond quickly enough because ideology prevented action. Today's political environment mirrors 1929 with eerie precision. The federal government came within days of default in 2023 during debt ceiling negotiations. Congress required 15 ballots to elect a Speaker of the House in January 2023, the most since 1859. Infrastructure investment, tax reform, and financial regulation face partisan deadlock. The Federal Reserve operates independently, but Congress controls fiscal policy. And fiscal policy is paralyzed. When the next crisis hits, will Congress pass emergency spending? Will it bail out banks again? Will it support unemployed workers? The political fragmentation suggests response will be slow, contested, and insufficient. Just like 1929. So let's connect all the pieces. 9 patterns from the Great Depression are operating simultaneously in 2024. Credit expansion masking wage stagnation. Stock speculation detached from fundamentals. Banking fragility through interconnection. Income inequality creating consumption crisis. Asset bubbles in essential goods. Corporate debt funding buybacks instead of investment. Trade imbalances amid protectionist politics. Interest rate increases into economic weakness. And political gridlock preventing coordinated response. Each pattern alone creates vulnerability. Together, they create inevitability. The Great Depression didn't happen because of Black Tuesday. Black Tuesday happened because these 9 structural problems reached critical mass simultaneously. The crash was the moment of recognition, not the cause of collapse. The system had been failing for years. Most people just couldn't see it, until stock prices confirmed what the underlying economy had been signaling all along. We're not living in a world that learned from 1929. We're living in a world that rebuilt the same architecture with different materials. The Federal Reserve exists, but its tools deepen the problems they're meant to solve. Banking regulation exists, but interconnection creates systemic risk regulation can't contain. Safety nets exist, but income inequality means half the population lives one crisis away from catastrophe. The patterns haven't been prevented, they've been perfected. 9 warning signs America is sliding into another Great Depression. The evidence doesn't suggest it might happen. The evidence suggests it's happening right now. We're just waiting for the moment of recognition. And history says that moment comes suddenly, unexpectedly, and far too late to prevent what the patterns have already made inevitable.